The cycle of great powers. Throughout thousands of years of human history, the world has witnessed the rise and fall of great powers. From ancient Rome and the British Empire to the Soviet Union, each empire once stood at the pinnacle of power, exerting profound economic and military influence globally before being dethroned. Presently, the United States and China are seen as the two central nations in the historical cycle of hegemony. The U.S. still holds the position of superpower, but its seat is somewhat shaky due to various reasons. On the other side is China, with its massive population and centralized political system, quietly rising at an astonishing pace over the past 20 years. Will the 21st century witness another cycle of power transition in human history? And will history repeat itself, or will it turn a new page in an unprecedented way? Let's discuss this in the following article. This article provides an economic analysis and geopolitical forecast, posted here for public discussion. There may be unavoidable errors. We hope everyone will approach the following content with an open mind and not take it as absolute truth or overly serious. 1. The rise of China. After World War II, the world entered the Cold War era, a prolonged confrontation between two opposing ideological blocs, Marxism led by the Soviet Union and Western liberalism led by the United States. This tension was heightened by the domino theory, the belief that the fall of one nation to communism would trigger the collapse of neighboring countries. In this context, the U.S. and China, positioned at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, viewed each other as sworn enemies. However, in the late 1960s, Sino-Soviet relations began to deteriorate significantly, even leading to armed border conflicts. The U.S. saw this as a strategic opportunity to divide the two largest communist adversaries. In 1971, a seemingly non-political event, a ping-pong tournament between the U.S. and Chinese teams, marked the beginning of a historic diplomatic turning point, known as ping-pong diplomacy. This event helped break down decades-long barriers between Washington and Beijing. The pinnacle was President Richard Nixon's 1972 visit to China, a symbolic trip that signaled the reestablishment of relations between the two rival superpowers and a clear indication that the U.S. was strategically betting on pulling China out of the Soviet orbit. From then on, the U.S. and the West gradually encouraged China to integrate into the global economy. They believed that as China became more dependent on international value chains, Western economic and social institutions would force it to reform. This belief was rooted in the expectation that economic development would lead to political evolution, a common notion in liberal philosophy. In other words, the West hoped that an open China would become a democratic China, following the path of other East Asian nations like South Korea or Taiwan. However, this expectation overlooked a core factor. China's political system has the ability to absorb, adapt, and leverage globalization to strengthen its internal power rather than fundamentally change it. Indeed, communist nations have maintained their political systems while simultaneously opening up and orienting toward free markets. Anti-Russian sentiment has been deeply ingrained in European geopolitical thinking and popular culture since the 18th century. Russia has often been viewed as a distinct Eastern European giant, misunderstood as barbaric tatters, half Asian, half European. This entrenched mindset has made it difficult for Russia to integrate into the Western order in terms of history, religion, culture, and politics. This caused Russia's initial post-Cold War integration efforts to gradually fail, transforming into a defensive posture and then a counteroffensive through strategies, like creating security buffer zones in border regions such as Georgia and Ukraine. The irony of history is that China, the nation the West hoped would reform, did not change its political system, while Russia, which once sought integration, was pushed further away. Instead of political transformation, China used its open-door policy as a tool to elevate its global standing. Initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, and especially the Made in China 2025 plan demonstrate that Beijing has no intention of westernizing. On the contrary, they aim to lead a new order where China becomes the global center of industry and technology. After joining the WTO in 2001, China fully leveraged its cheap labor, vast market size, crises in the Western political economic system, and preferential treatment from Western companies to achieve rapid development. Over the past 20 years, China has maintained an average labor productivity growth rate of 7.7%, significantly outpacing the second highest region, India, at 5.6%, and far surpassing developed regions like North America at 1.6% and Western Europe at 0.8%. The result is that, made in China, goods have flooded the global market with competitive prices, while traditional industries in the U.S. and Europe face both job crises and declining production capacity. Dependence on China's supply chains, particularly in semiconductors, renewable energy, and consumer electronics, has created a significant global imbalance. Compounding this growing imbalance are successive global shocks over the past 2 decades. From the 2008 global financial crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic, which have gradually weakened critical links in the global political economic system. To better understand China's rising role in this context, we must revisit the structure of Western economies. These nations, with their early advantages in industrial development and superior technology, once dominated markets with high quality, expensive products and a robust consumer economy. Before these major crises, most Western consumers paid little attention to low-cost, low-quality products from China. Phones, electronics, machinery, and cars were more trusted when they bore brands from the U.S., Europe, South Korea, or Japan. At the same time, China's domestic production capacity was largely limited to copying or processing simple goods, lacking the ability to create high-tech, strong-branded products. The Made in China label once carried a negative reputation worldwide. However, after the 2008 global financial crisis, a quiet but profound turning point arrived. Confidence in the Western financial system declined, prompting a wave of large corporations to restructure supply chains to cut costs, while workers in developed nations faced unemployment and reduced incomes. The COVID-19 pandemic delivered a second blow to the global economic system, disrupting supply chains, driving up labor costs, and forcing many economies to rely again on low-cost production links. In this context, Chinese goods, once overlooked, emerged as an indispensable lifeline for ordinary global consumers. From being dismissed, made-in-China products gradually became essential for the majority of low to middle-income people. Reality showed that during the 2008 recession, despite being affected by reduced purchasing power in the U.S., China became a bright star in 2009, achieving 9% growth while other nations were still reeling from the recession. Similarly, post-COVID crisis, China was the first economy to recover, with record-high export output in 2021. This reality proved that cheap Chinese goods were the top choice after each recession. However, this dominance was not merely the result of price advantages, but a direct outcome of the restructuring of an entire economic system, where the West gradually lost its core production role and China stepped up as the world's factory. But this time, it was not just with cheap goods, but also advanced technology and superior supply chain organization capabilities. China's rise came not only from leveraging abundant, cheap, and disciplined labor, but also from a strategy of intelligently and systematically utilizing resources and investing in infrastructure. Unlike many other countries that focus solely on exporting raw resources or cheap processing, China proactively invested in domestic logistics through public projects, bridges, roads, high-speed railways, ports, industrial zones, and urban infrastructure, known as the Build First, Profit Later strategy. The core philosophy of this strategy is that infrastructure creates jobs and drives economic flow. China builds numerous public projects, especially during economic challenges, covering everything from bridges and roads to stadiums and airports. During economic crises, China invests even more in construction. To achieve this, Beijing first mobilizes funds easily by lowering interest rates and channeling money into state-owned enterprises. These state-owned enterprises then use the funds to invest heavily in infrastructure projects. Economic benefits of these projects are often overlooked, as many have low economic value. It's not hard to find articles about train stations in uninhabited areas or highways leading nowhere. It doesn't matter because these projects create jobs, thereby boosting the GDP of the entire economy. On the other hand, when transportation opens up, local economies also grow. When remote areas are connected, production and consumption capacities expand. However, this approach cannot sustain China's economy indefinitely. If 20 years ago, China had an investment efficiency ratio of $4 invested for $1 of economic output, by 2021, this had risen to $12 for $1. Thanks to this, by early 2020, China had become a middle-income country with the infrastructure of a wealthy nation. This laid the foundation for implementing protectionist policies, nurturing domestic enterprises, and supporting competition with foreign goods. From its infrastructure advantage, China expanded control over supply chains. Large-scale industrial clusters were planned by sector, from raw materials to production and distribution. All of this occurs within a small scope, significantly shortening production time and reducing intermediary costs. This leads to an unparalleled advantage. China's logistics costs are the cheapest and fastest in the world. Alongside these advantages, protectionist policies also help nurture domestic manufacturing enterprises, creating a formidable replication production capacity. I've had a real-life experience as follows. A Western startup might spend years on R&D to develop a tech product, but within weeks or even hours after the product hits the market, a cheaper copy with equivalent or even better functionality emerges from China. It's not just about speed, but an entire production and market access ecosystem that has advanced tremendously. While the West is constrained by patent law systems and heavy capital investment models, Chinese enterprises are empowered by flexible policies. Coupled with this is a massive market ready to consume any product made. China is also proactive in attracting ethnic Chinese talent working in major tech companies in the US, Europe, or Japan. In many cases, this is not merely repatriating talent, but a systematic strategy to access and acquire core technological secrets. A typical example is the case involving ASML, the world's leading manufacturer of photolithography machines for chip production, where a senior ethnic Chinese employee left the company and later brought a group of senior engineers to China to found SMIC, currently China's largest semiconductor company. Beyond advantages in population scale, technological potential, and economic momentum, China also has a strategic advantage that Western nations struggle to replicate. The authoritarian state model allows the nation to act as a unified entity. This political unity has enabled Beijing to disperse funds quickly, implement policies rapidly, and be particularly effective in situations requiring centralized responses, from controlling the COVID-19 pandemic to developing cutting-edge industries. A prime example is the semiconductor industry, a critical field in future technological competition. While the Biden administration passed the CHIPS Act to support Intel and revive the domestic semiconductor industry, which is considered less efficient, China has maintained an average investment of about $55 billion annually in this sector. Since launching the Made in China 2025 strategy, the gap lies not only in numbers, but also in the speed and ability to implement synchronously nationwide. This difference is also evident in the ability to implement mega infrastructure and industrial projects. When the U.S. attempted to build TSMC chip manufacturing plants, the project faced numerous internal obstacles and a lack of skilled labor suited to the specific requirements. Labor unions opposed bringing Taiwanese workers to the U.S., citing concerns over cheap foreign labor. This is a typical example of conflicts of interest between political groups slowing project progress. Meanwhile, China can quickly mobilize resources, allocate land, build infrastructure, and provide funding for large-scale semiconductor complexes in a short time. This is something difficult to achieve in the Western multi-party democratic system, where major decisions are influenced by numerous intervening parties and underlying conflicts of interest. Thus, from a poor nation, China has gradually asserted its position and become a manufacturing and technological powerhouse. Thanks to a strategy of selective integration, smart protectionist policies, and remarkable adaptability to the new global order. This rise not only reshapes the global economic balance, but also directly challenges the West's core belief in the relationship between globalization and democratization. Misplaced expectations and bias in the treatment of China versus Russia have left profound geopolitical consequences, shaping today's strategic competition landscape. No, let's get some information from China's Shortcut about GDP of China in 2025.
Hello and welcome to China Shortcuts,
the European Chamber's weekly catch-up on China's business landscape.
On 15th July, the National Bureau of Statistics, or NBS, released China's second quarter gross domestic product, or GDP data, which showed a growth of 5.2%.
The figure represents a modest slowdown compared with the first quarter of 2025, when growth measured 5.4%. However, the data suggests that China is still on track to meet its 2025 GDP growth target of around 5%. In a press conference in conjunction with the data release, NBS Deputy Commissioner Sheng Laiyun noted that GDP growth this year has so far exceeded last year's 5% growth rate, something that he put down to overall stability in the Chinese economy. Policymakers will likely view above-target GDP growth as a sign that stimulus measures are working. However, it has yet to be seen if European businesses in China, for whom China's economic slowdown is the top business challenge according to the European Chamber's Business Confidence Survey 2025, have seen a positive change.
When Donald Trump unleashed a fresh trade war against China, many people thought it would simply be a matter of time before they were forced to buckle. They sell nearly $600 billion worth of goods to the US every year and depend on them for 15% of all of their exports. On the surface, it seemed obvious that they couldn't survive. But what they did next shocked the world. Instead of flinching, they fired back, fast, matching tariffs, cutting off key exports, and sending a clear message: we don't care. But something doesn't make sense. How can a country seemingly dependent on selling goods survive without its biggest customer? Well, behind the scenes, something has changed. Over the past decade, China has secretly been rebuilding the foundations of its economy. Instead of spending, they're investing, with 40% of their annual GDP being poured into investments every year, almost double that of any other major economy. And the results are hard to ignore. Chinese firms are rising to replace US companies at the top of the food chain. BYD has overtaken Tesla as the biggest EV manufacturer. TikTok has become one of the biggest and fastest growing social media platforms in the world, and Chinese brands everywhere are quickly moving up the chain. China isn't just trying to survive without the US, it's showing the world that it can lead without it. So, has China actually made itself economically indestructible? Or is this all just smoke and mirrors? You've probably seen the headlines. China's property market collapsing, the economy crumbling under an aging population, and millions of unemployed youth. And yet, mega factories are being built daily. High-speed rail now connects the entire country, and some of the most advanced technology on Earth no longer comes from the West. So which China is real? The truth is both. The West is caught between these two conflicting realities, struggling to understand the new China. Because the story we've told ourselves for decades is starting to fall apart. Ever since they opened up to trade in the 1970s, China's economic rise has been fueled by the West. The largest population came with low wages, and China took advantage of it to become a manufacturing hub. They built factories for Apple, powered Amazon's supply chain, and attracted billions in Western investment. From the 1990s through the 2000s, China's economy grew at an astonishing pace, averaging nearly 10% annual GDP growth for years. The model was simple. China made and America bought. It was fast, cheap, and efficient, but also deeply dependent. For decades, the US and China were deeply intertwined trading partners. China became the world's factory floor, exporting cheap goods to American consumers and attracting trillions worth of foreign investment each year. By 2010, China had become the world's second largest economy, and its factories weren't just cheap anymore, they were also getting smarter. In places like Shenzhen, The same assembly lines that once churned out knockoffs had slowly learnt from their experience, now producing cutting-edge technology at a fraction of the cost of America. At the same time, the US kept on importing more and more from them. By 2018, China's trade surplus with the US had ballooned to over $400 billion, and concerns over economic dependency were starting to grow. The idea that a rising authoritarian power could hold this much control over global supply chains, and by extension, the American economy as a whole, became a threat too big to ignore. To make matters worse, from 2001 to 2017, the US lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, many of them outsourced to China, and gradually the media and politicians began to point fingers. Chinese firms were thriving in the US market, scooping up market share, cutting prices and scaling fast. But American companies, they couldn't break into China in the same way. Many began accusing the Chinese government of playing dirty, handing out money to firms to make their goods cheaper, and protecting their biggest companies with anti-competition laws, so their foreign competitors didn't stand a chance. The idea of confronting China was starting to gain momentum, and when Donald Trump first ran for president in 2016, on a promise to take on China's trade practices once and for all, he won. Almost immediately after taking office, he kept his promise, slapping trade tariffs on hundreds of billions worth of Chinese goods. The logic was simple: raise the costs of importing from China and push American companies to bring production back home, protecting domestic manufacturing. But that still wasn't enough. The US also protected its decade-old technological advancements and did everything in their power to stop China from gaining the upper hand. They blacklisted Huawei, barred American companies from selling critical chips, and restricted China's access to advanced semiconductors. This wasn't just about trade anymore, it was strategic dominance. From 2018 to 2020, the tension just escalated, and then it simmered under Biden. He didn't aggressively increase the tariffs like Trump did, but he also didn't reduce them either. The direction was clear, the decoupling had begun. By 2025, under a second Trump presidency, the conflict came roaring back. A fresh wave of tariffs were announced, targeting Chinese EVs, solar equipment, batteries, and key tech components. Some tariffs reached 100%, sending a clear message: we're done with being dependent. Thanks to your support, running this channel has turned into my full-time job, and combined with living in London, it means endless meetings and calls. Just to rely on my iPhone for capturing, but background noise, battery drain, and constant interruptions were a nightmare, and that's why I switched to Claude Note, a dedicated AI note-taker designed for clarity and convenience. It snaps onto my phone and can capture calls, meetings, or quick voice notes on the go, and turns everything I say into clear transcripts, with speakers labeled, and even summaries, mind maps, or to-do lists. Instead of taking notes, now I can focus on the conversation, and even better, use their Ask AI feature for deeper insights into my notes, which saves me hours rereading what I've already typed up. It captures up to 32 hours without killing my battery, and everything syncs safely to the cloud. If you're always stuck in meetings, run your own business, or just hate wasting time taking notes, for a limited time, get 22% off your Claude Note with code FUTURE22. Perfect for students, professionals, anyone who needs reliable recordings. Use the link and code in the description and comments. But this time, something was different. The first time around, China was cautious. It negotiated, compromised, tried to de-escalate. But now, China fired back immediately, matching tariffs, banning rare earth exports, and blacklisting American firms. This wasn't the China of 2001 or even 2016. This was a new China, bolder, more self-assured, and ready to fight back. And to many in the West, it was a wake-up call. Had China quietly built an economy that no longer needed the US? The trade war was no longer just about trade. It had become a battle over who gets to shape the future of the global economy. And for the first time in decades, the US may not have the final say. Beijing knows exactly what the rest of the world suspects. But a giant built on exports can't survive if the world stops buying. So, over the past decade, China has been quietly trying to rewire its economy from a machine fueled by American demand into a system that can run on its own. At the heart of this transformation was a concept introduced by Xi Jinping, a strategy known as dual circulation, which will lay the blueprint for an entirely new kind of Chinese economy. One designed to be resilient, self-sustaining, and far less exposed to the West. Here's how it works. The first engine, internal circulation, focuses on strengthening domestic demand. It's about turning China's 1.4 billion citizens into the main driver of its own growth. That means promoting household consumption, building local supply chains, and investing in homegrown innovation. The second engine, external circulation, keeps global trade alive, but with a twist. Instead of relying heavily on the US and Europe, China is forging new trade routes and diversifying its partners across the global south. Asian, African, Latin American, the Middle East. And it's already reshaping the entire structure of China's economy. Despite the age-old image of China as an export-driven powerhouse, the numbers tell a different story. They're not as reliant on external consumption as you may think. In 2024, domestic consumption actually made up 45% of GDP, more than double that of exports, and it's actually been this way for a while. Over the past decade, household consumption has consistently contributed to at least half of China's GDP growth, meaning that the vast majority of its output is actually consumed domestically. Chinese people are buying home-produced Chinese cars, electronics, and even Chinese luxury brands. But no matter how good that sounds, this level of consumption is still very weak, especially when compared to other major economies, where we regularly see household spending more than 60 to 70% of GDP. And while the Chinese government has tried to get more people spending through policies like cheap loans and subsidized trading programs, most families are still playing it safe, cutting back on debt and saving money instead. Why? Because the real problem remains unchecked. Despite being a socialist country, social safety nets like unemployment benefits and pension support are almost non-existent. China spends less than 1% of their GDP on safety net programs, one of the lowest levels in the world, making it incredibly hard for people to weather economic shocks, job losses, or health emergencies. At the same time, its housing market is in crisis. Ever since 2019, China's property value growth has constantly been declining, and now many homes are even losing their value, with houses costing an average of 4.5% less than they did last year. And if that wasn't enough, China's shrinking birth rates have shrunk to the point where more people are dying than being born. And if this continues, they are on track to have one of the fastest aging and shrinking workforces in the world. This makes many families feel pressure to save for healthcare, retirement, or their children's education. So while domestic consumption is certainly growing, it still hasn't taken over the entire economy just yet. The truth is, China's economy still leans heavily on factories, exports, and investment. But the shift to consumer spending is real, even if it's slow. That's the whole point of this dual circulation model. Not to end trade with the world, but to survive without being dependent on it. China wants to become resilient, to build an economy that won't collapse if US consumers stop buying, or if the West imposes new sanctions. So while the transformation isn't finished, one thing is clear. China isn't just playing defense. It's building an economic system designed to outlast the storm. A key part of this strategy is shifting trading partners. As the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu once said, "Do not depend on the enemy not coming, but depend rather on being ready for him." China isn't betting on the world staying friendly. It's preparing for a future where it doesn't have to ask. In 2000, America bought over 20% of China's exports, but by 2023, that number had dropped to only 15%. On the surface, it looked like China was losing ground as exports to their biggest market fell, but in reality, its global export share kept rising. China hasn't changed how much it's exporting, but rather who those goods were going to. From Southeast Asia to South America, Chinese goods are everywhere, and the Asian countries are now China's top trading partner. In Africa, Chinese investment in infrastructure has captured the hunger for their abundant minerals. In Latin America and the Middle East, demand for Chinese machinery, energy tech, and consumer products is booming. Piece by piece, China is steadily shifting away from resilience on developed markets like the US and pivoting towards the global south. And how did they do that? They built railways through the mountains of Laos, ports in Sri Lanka, highways in Kenya, power plants in Pakistan. This is the Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious strategy launched in 2013, to connect China to the rest of the world through infrastructure by funding and building major projects all across the globe, and it has become the backbone of China's strategy to forge strong relationships with new potential trading partners. Since its launch, China has spent over $1 trillion funding this mega project, and at first many of the West mocked it for its overreach, too ambitious, too expensive, but a decade later, the results are hard to ignore. By 2024, over 140 countries have joined the BRI, collectively representing nearly 75% of the world's population. But Belt and Road isn't just about roads and bridges, it's about influence. By financing essential infrastructure in countries where Western investment was minimal, China has embedded itself into the economic lifelines, and in return is gaining loyal trading partners, securing demand for Chinese products, and most of all, reducing its dependency on the US. The numbers speak for themselves. The group of Asian countries has now overtaken the US to become China's largest trading partner, buying up $500 billion worth of Chinese exports in 2024 alone. At the same time, they've become the biggest trading partner of South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, and many other key members of the BRICS alliance, a group of rising economies in the global south who now make up 45% of the entire global population. Despite this, the US still remains significant to China, and moving away from such a powerful market will no doubt still hurt them. But the shift shows how China now has an increasingly diverse and growing network of new partners. It's no longer just a factory for the West. It's become a hub of new global trade. And if this bet works, it could redefine not just trade routes, but the balance of power. But China knows it can't just rely on consumers and trade alone. To truly stand out, it must build a powerful engine underneath, one fueled by massive investment, cutting-edge technology, and rock-solid infrastructure. Since 2018, China has poured more than $500 billion into R&D. It's subsidizing strategic industries, trying to outcompete the West by being able to independently produce and gain control over some of the most advanced technology on Earth. Take semiconductors, the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. When the US slapped export bans on key chips, making equipment and targeted Huawei with sanctions, many assumed China's ambitions would be crushed. But instead, Huawei shocked the world in 2023 by unveiling a homegrown 7nm chip, a breakthrough only possible because of massive state investment in domestic technology. And at the same time, Chinese chip makers like SMIC are closing the gap, producing increasingly advanced chips to fuel everything from 5G networks to electric vehicles. And on the EV front, things are going just as well. BYD has overtaken Tesla as the world's largest electric car maker in 2022 and remained in front ever since. It's not just cars and chips. China's infrastructure is also staggering, with a high-speed rail network which stretches over 40,000 kilometers, longer than the rest of the world combined, paired with ports, green energy projects, and digital infrastructure, all expanding at breakneck speed to fuel the new economy. They now produce roughly 1 in 3 of all manufactured goods in the entire world. In many industries, China is making far more than what the market needs. More steel than it can use, more solar panels than it can install, and more EVs than it can sell domestically. To many in the West, this seemed like a looming overcapacity problem. By overloading the market with too much supply, prices will fall, making the industry less profitable than it could be. But to China, overcapacity isn't a flaw, it's being used as a weapon. By flooding the world with affordable goods, China embeds itself into crucial parts of global supply chains. Europe needs Chinese solar panels to power their green transition. American EVs need Chinese batteries to run. And buildings all across Asia need Chinese steel. So instead of a weakness, the more that China makes, the more the world depends on it. And it becomes harder and harder to say no to China.
But also stalls production.
This transformation was powered by a system unique to China, state-led capitalism. But this level of control also comes with a cost. Unlike the West, where private capital often drives innovation, much of China's transformation has been funded directly by the state. To keep the engine running, China has had to keep on spending, and they were forced to lean heavily on borrowed money, piling up public debt at a pace not seen in decades. By 2026, China is continued to pass 100% levels
They
of
have
debt
fresh
to
energy,
GDP.
strong
This could be
will,
signaling
and
a
systems
risk that
better
China
suited
is
to the
fueling
era.
growth faster
As
than
the
it can
dominant
absorb it.
empire
We've
weakens
seen this
internally
before.
and
Ghost
rivals rise
cities,
externally,
idle factories,
conflicts
high-speed
arise,
rail
trade
lines with
wars,
too few
proxy
passengers.
wars,
If
or
China
total
keeps on
wars.
building more than the
These are
economy can
resolved through
realistically
power
use,
struggles.
all of this investment
Challengers
could end up
initiate
sitting idle.
conflict
The
after
US-China
observing
relationship
systemic
is no
and
longer
internal
what it used to be.
weaknesses in their
The days
opponent.
of quiet
Dominant
interdependence,
nations
where
face a
China
choice:
made and American
fight
bought,
or
are
retreat.
over.
Fighting
In
and
some
losing
ways,
is
China
the
no
worst
longer
option,
needs the
but
US like it
retreating
once
is
did.
nearly as bad,
It's built new
signaling
factories,
weakness to
new
neutral
trade routes,
nations
and new
and
alliances.
allowing
It's
rivals
pouring
to
trillions into its own
Thus,
technology,
neither
feeding
side
its own
backs
consumer
down,
market,
and
and investing in an
confrontations
economic
almost
machine
always escalate.
designed to weather
Whether
whatever
through
storms
trade
may
wars
come.
or military conflicts,
But that doesn't mean it's
increasing the
untouchable.
risk of global
China
conflict.
hasn't fully replaced the West.
Maintaining
Its
global
consumers don't
influence
spend
is
like
costly,
Americans.
and
Its
coupled
chip
with
industry
growing
still lags
domestic
behind,
economic
and its
discontent,
economy still
the
bears the
dominant
scars
nation
of a
faces
property
significant
crisis, sluggish
disadvantages.
demand, and mounting
Ultimately,
debt.
these
What China
confrontations
isn't doing
produce
is
winners
retreating,
and
it's
losers,
rebuilding.
with the victor
Quietly,
reshaping the
steadily,
world
it's
order,
crafting something
restarting the
else.
cycle.
A parallel economic
This is the
system,
grand cycle
one less
repeating
exposed
over
to
the
US
past
pressure
500
and more
years
embedded
from the Dutch
across the
Empire,
global south.
the British Empire,
Because this isn't
the
just
United
about trade
States,
wars or
and
sanctions
China's strong
anymore.
rise
It's
today.
about whether the US can
Each
still
cycle
call
is
shots
unique,
in a
but
world where
forms a
China
recurring
no longer
pattern,
plays by its
with
rules.
competition centered
The
on
age of
technology
American-led
and resources.
globalization is fading.
We cannot
And the
entirely
question
stop
isn't
the
if
cycle
China
of
will
rise and
survive,
fall,
it's how
as
the
a
rest
new
of the world will
empire's
adapt.
rise may be as inevitable as the human life cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death. However, we can better understand an empire's health indicators to predict this stage in the cycle, whether it is growing, maturing, or declining. This allows smarter decisions at individual and national levels to adapt and prepare for the next phase. From this grand cycle, we conclude that conflict between China and the U.S. is inevitable. 4. Current situation and predictions. In the increasingly intense geopolitical competition between today's two superpowers, building a new strategy based on alliance scale is critical for the U.S. This challenge stems not only from China's actions, but also from how the U.S. evaluates and often misjudges its rivals' true strength. Underestimating China's capabilities could lead to serious long-term consequences, especially as China holds superior strategic advantages in many areas. In reality, Washington's assessment of Beijing has swung between extremes. After the 2008 financial crisis, China was predicted to soon surpass the U.S., especially as it demonstrated resilience and strong growth during the COVID-19 pandemic. Recently, optimism has surged in the U.S. as China's economy slows, while the U.S. achieves notable successes in technology and supply chains. However, this complacency is dangerous, weakening awareness of the reality that, despite slower growth, China remains the U.S.'s most formidable strategic rival ever. China is the only nation in the past century with a GDP exceeding 70% of the U.S., milestone even the Soviet Union never reached. In many critical areas, China is surpassing or significantly closing the gap with the U.S. economically. China's production capacity is double that of the U.S. In technology, Beijing leads globally in electric vehicles and next-generation nuclear reactors, with the most active patents and highly cited scientific publications annually. Militarily, China possesses the world's largest navy, shipbuilding capacity 200 times greater than the U.S., a superior arsenal of medium-range missiles, and leadership in hypersonic technology. These achievements result from the fastest military modernization in modern history. Even with slower growth, China maintains a comprehensive competitive edge for at least the next decade. Not just a rising challenge, but a superpower capable of challenging the U.S. order. During the Cold War, Soviet leaders emphasized that quantity has a quality of its own. When production is balanced, nations with larger populations and geographic scope wield greater economic and military power, dominating smaller, more advanced nations. This dynamic has persisted throughout history. The U.S. benefited from it in the last century, catching up to Europe's technological wave and leveraging its continental scale and population to surpass the UK, Germany, Japan, and eventually the Soviet Union. Today, China benefits from this dynamic, and the U.S. being overtaken technologically, deindustrialized economically, and defeated militarily by a rival with far greater scale and production capacity. In this new era of competition, nations acting on a large scale gain strategic advantages. China can do this unilaterally, while the U.S., acting alone, faces severe limitations. Thus, the only path to maintaining U.S. leadership is building and strengthening a global-scale alliance architecture. If Washington retreats to the Western Hemisphere, it not only abandons the rest of the world, but also allows China to fill the void. Thus, while China exerts influence through the BRI, assuming the U.S. will self-isolate is a grave miscalculation. History provides a valuable lesson. In the early 20th century, the British Empire allied with its longtime rival, France, to counter a rapidly industrializing Germany. This mirrors today's situation, where the U.S. must reassess its biases toward Russia, or at least reshape its alliance structure for strategic effectiveness. Moreover, the U.S.'s traditional alliance approach, treating partners as dependent satellites, is outdated. In today's complex world, the U.S. cannot lead alone, but must build an integrated, co-creative alliance platform. This means expanding partnership networks with strategically positioned nations around China, such as Russia, India, the Middle East, ASEAN, and East Asia. This strategy resembles the U.S.'s Cold War approach, allying with Europe, befriending China, and influencing the Middle East. Instead of merely sharing information or coordinating military efforts sporadically, the U.S. needs a new alliance architecture where nations not only cooperate, but also substantively integrate defense, technology, and economic capabilities. No magic can instantly revive U.S. manufacturing, so the nation must seek production partners, especially those with defense manufacturing capabilities. This could start with concrete actions. Japan and South Korea assisting in building or expanding U.S. shipbuilding capacity, Taiwan investing in and operating semiconductor plants in the U.S., and the U.S. sharing advanced defense technology with trusted allies. All should collaborate to establish tariff barriers and common technical standards to counter China's global expansion. This relationship must be reciprocal. U.S. shipbuilding and semiconductor plants may be largely automated, meaning they create few jobs, potentially increasing domestic unrest, but necessary to prepare for future conflicts. With the U.S. in the fifth stage of its decline cycle and China's strong rise, a confrontation, even a full-scale war between the two superpowers is hard to avoid, though not necessarily a traditional military war. The early Trump administration showed signs of détente, with both sides facing domestic pressures and seeking soft solutions through trade negotiations and deals like TikTok, even sparking hopes for a rebalanced era, as both needed time to consolidate internally. However, things changed as Trump made progress in negotiations with Russia and achieved successes in government restructuring efforts tied to Elon Musk's campaign, while China made significant strides in AI telecommunications and space. Growing confident in countering U.S. demands, Beijing's silence on the TikTok deal signals it no longer expects goodwill negotiations from Washington. Still, China's current advantages are medium to long term. If war breaks out now, Beijing would be at a disadvantage. Creating tensions now could provoke opposition from nations, especially in South America and the Middle East, where China pursues soft diplomacy to sway them from Western influence. Conversely, prolonging the conflict risks two major challenges for China. First, a demographic crisis, as China has entered an aging phase, and future wars could exacerbate labor shortages. Currently, China maintains a ratio of 100 adults supporting 44 dependents, a figure that, while rising, won't exceed Japan's 171 until 2050, giving China a roughly two-decade window of effective labor competition. The second risk is that prolonging conflict gives the U.S. time to address internal social issues, revive industrial strength, reshape global supply chains, and accelerate technology transfers from East Asia. Faced with this dilemma, China must adopt a proactive preparation strategy, including strengthening alliances, especially with nations wavering between the two sides. The more nations lean toward Beijing, the fewer economic shocks China will face in a potential war. In fact, the yuan is not only becoming a reserve currency, but also laying the groundwork for an independent payment system by forcing nations to choose sides, with Vietnam potentially being one of the first pawns. Unsubstantiated tariffs and Trump's skeptical remarks about Xi Jinping's Vietnam visit may make countries like Vietnam wary of choosing the U.S. as a long-term ally. Conversely, as previously analyzed, if nations like Taiwan or Vietnam face conflict or lean toward China, this indirectly serves Trump's long-term strategy. A war in the Taiwan Strait would force nations like South Korea and Japan to increase trade with the U.S. Critical supply chains, including consumer electronics and semiconductors, would shift to the U.S. or nations unaffected by China, like India. Thus, the U.S. would gain revenue through trade with Northeast Asia and access Taiwan's semiconductor technology. Consequently, Vietnam would increasingly lean toward China in foreign policy, while the risk of war or political instability in the Taiwan Strait grows. For the U.S., allowing Vietnam or Taiwan to fall to China may bring strategic benefits, like supply chain restructuring and capital repatriation, but also carry significant risks, especially to credibility. In a short time since Trump took office, Taiwan, alongside Japan, committed hundreds of billions to TSMC plants in the U.S., critical to Washington's tech autonomy ambitions. Vietnam was also recently praised by Trump as a diplomatic model for negotiating tariff reductions with the U.S. The U.S. understands that it cannot face China alone. Regardless of military or economic strength, the U.S. needs a global alliance to counter Beijing. Thus, moves to strain partnerships like tariff threats or withdrawing from international agreements are primarily political bargaining chips to pressure for favorable economic or strategic deals. For example, Trump's push for Russia-Ukraine negotiations has multiple motives, notably securing Ukraine's abundant rare earths to reduce U.S. dependence on China. In this context, Trump will likely continue using tariffs as a deterrence tool, and each partner will face a critical question: which side are you on in this global contest? At a certain negotiation threshold, if nations don't meet U.S. expectations or show goodwill, they'll be labeled as leaning toward China, facing sanctions, isolation, or even military deterrence. For Vietnam, this could mean being forced to clearly choose a side, with Trump expecting Vietnam to align with the U.S. in foreign policy in exchange for trade benefits, or being seen as pro-China, losing privileges and potentially being flagged as suspicious without clear U.S. support. Meanwhile, Washington will continue probing Russia, hoping it can constrain China long-term or at least avoid deep alignment with Beijing. The EU will face continued pressure to rearm and enhance military capabilities. If this occurs, the U.S. will not only remain a weapons market, but also create an allied axis to contain the western flank of the Eurasian supercontinent, easing strategic burdens in both the Atlantic and Pacific. 5. Conclusion. China's rise is not a random phenomenon, but the result of three key factors: a massive population, a highly centralized political system, and an effective development model mobilizing national resources for long-term goals. Meanwhile, the decline of the U.S.-led order is an inevitable historical cycle, as seen with past dominant empires like Spain, the Netherlands, and the U.K. In this shifting world order, a common historical pattern is the realignment of traditional friend-foe structures, leading to a major U.S. reassessment of current allies and partners. In today's tense context, Taiwan is likely to become a flashpoint, a hotspot converging strategic, symbolic, technological, and geopolitical factors. China's increasing military tightening, internal purges, and strengthened positioning around the Taiwan Strait signal preparations for a larger conflict in the near future. Facing China's rapid rise, surpassing the U.S. in industrial production, global trade, and even technological infrastructure in many regions, the U.S. cannot remain idle. The return of corporations to the U.S. and the reindustrialization trend are not just economic choices, but strategic preparations for an inevitable confrontation. In this context, the Trump administration shows clear resolve. The U.S. strategy may have three core goals: redefining friend-foe boundaries to enhance cooperation with strategic partners, boosting revenue and reducing the massive public spending burden in the race with China, and reviving domestic industry, especially sectors with defense conversion potential like automotive or shipbuilding. In World War II, these industries became the backbone of U.S. weapons and war vehicle production. Notably, some strategic partners, particularly India, will receive U.S. preferential treatment in trade deals. In contrast to the U.S.'s hardline strategy, China pursues a more flexible and soft approach, extending open arms to global partners from Xi Jinping's Vietnam visit to broad cooperation offers with the EU. China is building an image as a friendly, reliable superpower, a peaceful counterpart to the U.S. However, this expanding cooperation paradoxically heightens war risks, as it shows Beijing urgently building an alliance network and a solid foundation for a strategic confrontation. The more partners China gains, the stronger its diplomatic shield, increasing conflict risks. The U.S.'s biggest issue now is complacency, especially the growing elite belief that China is entering a decline. Headlines in Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, or the New York Times often paint negative scenarios, from real estate bubbles to demographic crises and technological lag. However, focusing on the rival's weaknesses risks strategic miscalculation, overestimating the U.S.'s own strength. While the U.S. economy grows, labor costs have reached extreme highs, with minimum wages in some states 10 times higher than in countries like Vietnam. This forces youth reindustrialization to rely heavily on automation and robotics, reviving industry but not jobs, or at least not fast enough to match the economy's pace, especially for the industrial working class already harmed by globalization. The long-term result is rising social inequality. By underestimating the rival and believing it can do everything alone, the U.S. risks neglecting allies, its greatest advantage, global scale and networks. Conversely, China faces indecision. Beijing knows that if the U.S. acts too quickly and decisively, China could be drawn into conflict before completing its diplomatic, economic, and military defense ecosystem. But excessive restraint risks losing its image as a new superpower in the eyes of watching partners. China's ambition for Taiwan has never been hidden. From Mao Zedong to now, Chinese leaders have upheld the One China principle, emphasized even more under Xi Jinping. Today, Taiwan is not just a national symbol, but a strategic maritime position in Asia-Europe routes and a global semiconductor hub with TSMC and a top-tier tech ecosystem. Any conflict here would have global consequences far beyond the region. History shows major wars often start from small events, like the 1914 assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke, plunging Europe into World War I within 2 months. In the current Taiwan Strait context, a war would not just involve China, but mark a major turning point for the global order. Notably, over the past year, Western media reported China's quiet purge of at least 17 senior military generals, possibly signaling serious military restructuring and preparation for a potential near-future conflict. With these calculations and strategies, escalating confrontation between the two superpowers is certain. The U.S. will continue escalating tensions not only with China, but also with allies and partners to secure favorable deals for the coming conflict. Meanwhile, China will strengthen cooperation to attract new partners, reduce Western dependence, and ensure resilience in disputes with the U.S. If you enjoyed this article, please like and share to support us. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on future videos from the Economic Story channel. Thank you for listening.